In 2012, a teenage girl walked out of her family home and was never seen alive again. What followed were shocking revelations about a seemingly safe community harboring a dark secret. But what made this case truly unforgettable was what investigators discovered years later, something they never thought they'd find. Please leave a like and comment down below what time it is wherever you are. This ensures more true crime stories in the future. Let's get to it. Nestled in the heart of northern Idaho, the town of Rathdrum was surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. It wasn't a place where people worried about locking their doors at night. With fewer than 0 residents at the time, it was the kind of tight-knit community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Parents felt safe letting their children ride bikes through the neighborhood, and neighbors offered friendly waves or unhurried conversations as they mowed their lawns or walked their dogs. Violent crime was something locals read about in the news, happening in distant cities, not something that touched Rathdrum itself. It was this sense of relative peace and safety that would make what happened here all the more shocking. The morning of September 5th, 2016, started like any other in the quiet town. Families were returning home from Labor Day weekend trips, preparing for the start of the school year. The community was still humming with a sense of routine as people bustled about without much thought or worry. Among them was 17-year-old Madison Graham, a high school senior known for her outgoing personality and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She loved animals, especially her rescue cat, Tigger, and was always willing to help out neighbors with pet sitting or dog walking. Friends described her as someone who could light up a room with her laughter and kindness. That morning, as Madison walked out the door around 9:00 a.m., no one in her family thought anything was out of the ordinary. She mentioned heading to a friend's house and promised to be back by lunchtime. But Madison didn't come back. At first, her family wasn't too concerned. Madison was responsible and not the type to run off without a word. When she didn't answer her phone, they figured maybe her battery had died or she lost track of time while chatting with her friend. Several hours passed, and by early evening, worry had started to creep in. Calls to her close friends yielded the same response. No one had seen or heard from her all day. It wasn't like her to not check in. The last confirmed sighting of Madison was by a neighbor who saw her walking down the quiet residential street, backpack slung over one shoulder and earbuds in, humming along as she disappeared around the corner. By the time the sun set, panic had replaced the initial reassurance that she'd turn up. Madison's parents, Karen and Joe, called the police to report her missing. The initial response, as in many missing person cases, was cautious. Teenagers often stayed out later than expected, and most turned up within hours. Officers advised the family to wait overnight, hoping Madison would walk through the door. Maybe she ran into a friend, they suggested, trying to calm the panic in Karen's voice. But Karen felt deep in her gut that something was wrong. "This isn't like Madison," she insisted. She would have called. Those first 24 hours after someone goes missing are often the most critical, according to experts. It's in this window that investigators gather crucial details to track the person's movements. A 2019 study published by the National Institute of Justice found that immediate action, especially in small towns where resources may be limited, can make all the difference. Rathdrum's local officers, however, were working with limited manpower, and no sign of foul play in Madison's case. Without clear evidence of a struggle or injury, the initial search efforts were subdued. Officers drove through the streets looking for any sign of her, while family and friends called her cell phone repeatedly, only to go straight to voicemail. Karen and Joe began contacting everyone Madison had spoken to in the days prior. Her best friend Jessie admitted to seeing her 2 days earlier, but said they hadn't made concrete plans to hang out. Her boyfriend, Marcus, said he hadn't heard from her at all that morning. By sunrise on September 6th, the situation grew more serious. Volunteers joined Madison's parents in scouring parks, trails, and parking lots around Rathdrum. They handed out flyers featuring Madison's warm smile and the clothes she was last known to wear, a grey hoodie and ripped jeans. The search extended into the nearby forests that surrounded the town, with volunteers calling her name into the trees, hoping desperately for a response. Still, there was no sign of Madison. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The lack of clues baffled everyone involved. Her phone, which would usually be a vital piece of evidence in cases like this, had not been located or turned back on. There was no digital trail of calls, messages, or social media activity that could provide a lead. Search dogs brought in on the second day circled the area near her home, but the scent trail disappeared less than a quarter mile down the street. It was as though Madison had been plucked off the face of the earth. With every hour that passed, the chances of finding her diminished, and the Graham family's dread intensified. By the third day, Rathdrum residents were no longer going about their routines with the same carefree ease. Parents were driving their children to school instead of letting them walk, despite the short distances. Conversation at the local diner shifted from small talk to whispered theories about what might have happened to Madison. Was she still nearby? Had someone taken her? Nobody wanted to say the worst out loud, but the underlying fear was palpable. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a crack in the foundation of their safe little town. All of this was overshadowed by the glaring question that no one could answer. How could a 17-year-old girl, walking down her own street in broad daylight, disappear without a trace? Each theory raised more concerns. If it had been an accident, there would have been some evidence, tire marks, a discarded shoe, or even a call from a witness. Yet there was nothing. If it had been abduction, why had no one seen anything unusual? Rathdrum wasn't the kind of town where strangers blended in unnoticed. The police admitted that they were stumped. Days stretched into a week with no sign of Madison or the slightest explanation for her disappearance. Her family began holding vigils at the small park where she often walked their dog. Candles and flowers piled up around her photograph, casting a somber reminder to the town that the search was far from over. Karen, unable to hold back tears, spoke to the small crowd at one of the vigils. "Someone out there knows something," she said softly. "Please, if you've seen anything, if you've heard anything, don't stay silent." Though the image of Madison's bright smile on the missing posters brought a glimmer of hope, the mood in Rathdrum was grim. The police maintained their search, but the absence of any meaningful breakthroughs began to weigh on everyone involved. It was beginning to look like Madison's case might become one of the many haunting mysteries to go unsolved, until a simple observation, just days later, uprooted everything investigators thought they knew. For the first week after Madison Graham's disappearance, the investigation seemed to be spinning in circles. Every potential lead turned up empty, and the small-town police force struggled to uncover anything concrete. Flyers had blanketed the area, but none of the calls coming into the local tip line produced anything actionable. Neighbors reported seeing Madison heading toward her friend's house but couldn't recall seeing her after that. Detectives pulled hours' worth of surveillance footage from businesses along the street, but none captured so much as a fleeting glimpse of her. The public began to grow restless. In such a close-knit community, the idea that someone simply disappeared without a trace felt unimaginable. Frustration boiled over during a town hall meeting organized by Madison's family. Many attendees expressed anger at what they perceived as a slow response from law enforcement. Others voiced fears that whoever was responsible might still be among them. Karen Graham spoke during the meeting, her voice trembling. "We don't care how small the detail is," she pleaded. "If you know something, please, say something." That plea would unexpectedly make the difference. 3 days later, on September 11th, an employee at a gas station on the edge of town found something while taking out the trash. It was a cell phone, slightly scratched, with its screen shattered. At first, the discovery didn't seem remarkable. Found phones after busy weekends were fairly common, and the employee assumed someone had simply dropped it at the pump, but something told her to hold on to it and turn it over to her manager. What happened next might never have come to light if the store owner hadn't seen one of Madison's missing posters while running errands shortly afterward. The photo of Madison bore a striking resemblance to the face on the phone's lock screen. The manager called the police immediately. When investigators arrived, the phone was confirmed to be Madison's. It was the first tangible piece of evidence connected to her since she'd disappeared. But what it revealed raised more questions than answers. The phone's location wasn't along her known route to her friend's house. It was miles away, near the industrial outskirts of town. A recovery team carefully combed the area, hoping this meant they would find additional clues, but nothing else was discovered in the immediate vicinity. The lack of physical evidence surrounding the phone's recovery baffled police. Had someone deliberately placed it there? And if so, why? What police did have, however, was the chance to search the phone's data history. Although the lock screen obstructed full access, the idea was brought up to conduct a forensic examination of the device. Over the next 48 hours, specialized IT technicians began combing through the fragments of data that could be recovered. According to law enforcement, one small breakthrough that put this lead over the edge had to do with emergency contacts logged into the device. Forensic technicians found a clue in the form of an unsent text message. It was short, just a few words, but it sent chills down investigators' spines. It simply read, "Please, come G." which trailed off as though interrupted before it could be finished. This message had never been sent but remained stored deep within the unsaved metadata of the phone. The implications of that unfinished text message reframed the timeline of Madison's disappearance entirely. Police now believed she may have tried to reach out for help only moments before something happened to her. Equally concerning was the fact that testing revealed the phone had stopped connecting to local cell towers roughly an hour after Madison was last seen, meaning it had likely been shut off manually. Even though this was a far cry from definitively knowing what happened, it was finally enough to convince detectives they weren't dealing with a runaway or a tragic accident. Someone had Madison's phone, and possibly Madison herself. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the first actionable clue in missing persons cases often comes from persistence in expanding the search radius. Investigators in this case dug back through the areas surrounding where the phone had been found, determined to leave no stone unturned. Even slight irregularities could hold vital answers. This wider effort yielded a sighting that had previously gone unnoticed. A witness from a nearby auto parts store remembered seeing a vehicle that seemed out of place parked near the gas station on September 5, the day Madison vanished. It was described as an older model grey pickup truck with dents along one side. The driver, the witness claimed, appeared to be a man in his late 30s or early 40s who seemed to be in a hurry. Although details were limited, the sighting ruled out previous speculation that Madison had been abducted by someone she knew or had willingly walked into a situation with a trusted person. This vehicle belonged to someone who didn't fit into any known patterns in Madison's life. As strange as it seemed at the time, the mention of that truck jolted an older piece of vague information back to life. Within the first 48 hours of the investigation, a local resident had called in to report having heard screeching tires coming from the gas station's general direction around the time Madison was thought to have disappeared. This detail had initially been dismissed due to the lack of supporting evidence, but now, with confirmation of a vehicle in the area, it became relevant once again. Investigators returned to that resident, who described the sound as quick and abrupt, followed by what they thought sounded like metal hitting metal. Though lacking precision, this recollection helped shape the emerging narrative of what could have taken place in the hours after her disappearance. The small stack of findings, Madison's phone, the witness account of the truck, and the memory of screeching tires, gave investigators just enough to ask the public for help in identifying a truck matching the description. They released a bulletin to local television stations and circulated it widely online, requesting anyone with information about who owned or drove such a vehicle to contact Rathdrum police. Within hours, the tip line was buzzing. Although several of the calls were false leads, one stood out. A caller mentioned seeing a similar vehicle parked outside the property of a man who had recently moved to the area, but no one in the neighborhood seemed to know him well. He had introduced himself as Aaron, didn't wave to neighbors, and kept to himself for the most part, except for brief grocery runs. What caught the caller's attention was that Aaron had spent several hours quickly hosing down the truck and scrubbing its interior on the afternoon of September 6th, the day Madison's phone was discovered several miles away. Armed with this information, police tracked down the truck in question and identified the individual connected to it. His actual name was Gerald Anderson, a lifelong drifter with a history of short-term work and minor criminal offences across state lines. Anderson claimed he was new to Rathdrum, choosing the area for its quiet atmosphere and opportunities for work in the local lumber yards. His answers seemed plausible on the surface, but something about his demeanour unsettled investigators. According to police, Anderson was cooperative but overly nervous during early conversations, an observation that would later stand out as investigators began piecing more of his background together. For the first time since Madison's disappearance shook the town, detectives had someone they could officially call a person of interest. The discovery of Madison's phone may have been the initial turning point, but it was the relentless legwork, pulling at small threads, carefully rechecking details most would overlook, that opened the door to focusing on Gerald Anderson. What came next would peel back the layers of his life and shine a light on secrets lurking beneath Rathdrum's peaceful exterior. Gerald Anderson's name was barely known in Rathdrum before Madison Graham's disappearance. He had arrived in town only months earlier, renting a small, run-down house on the outskirts of the community. Neighbors described him as quiet and a bit standoffish, but not unusual enough to draw attention. The older model grey truck parked in his driveway became a common sight, though it often seemed to be coming and going at odd hours. When police knocked on his door after receiving the tip about him cleaning the truck shortly after Madison's disappearance, Anderson appeared calm, even polite. He answered officers' questions without hesitation, saying he had driven to a nearby lake to fish on the morning Madison vanished. What Anderson failed to explain, or perhaps assumed the police wouldn't notice, was why his version of events didn't match up with the witness's description of his truck near the gas station. Investigators had already placed his vehicle in the area during the critical time frame. Though Anderson insisted he had no connection to Madison whatsoever, the investigators couldn't ignore the irregularities in his story. And they didn't have to dig very deep to find more of them. One of the most glaring issues was Anderson's alibi. He claimed he had spent several hours fishing alone, but he couldn't name anyone who might have seen him there. When officers pressed him on specifics, such as what time he left or where exactly he had been along the lake, his responses grew increasingly vague. A few times, he stumbled over his words, contradicting earlier details. Police noted his demeanor had shifted. While he maintained a cooperative attitude on the surface, his body language told another story. Tapping fingers, avoiding prolonged eye contact, and shifting uncomfortably. In a town like Rathdrum, where people rarely needed airtight alibis, Anderson's unconvincing explanation stood out. It wasn't just his behavior during questioning that raised red flags. As investigators ran background checks, Anderson's past began to emerge. Though there was nothing on file linking him to violent crimes, there were reports of other behavioral warning signs. In one incident years earlier, Anderson had been accused of stealing from a co-worker at a lumberyard in Oregon. The charges had been dropped, but the employer described him as strange and secretive, recalling how Anderson would disappear during shifts and avoid conversations unless absolutely necessary. Neighbors in previous towns where Anderson had lived painted a picture of someone who deliberately kept others at arm's length. None of this was proof of involvement in Madison's disappearance, but it showed a pattern. Anderson didn't live the kind of life that left behind deep ties or trustworthy witnesses. Searching for answers, detectives began comparing Anderson's responses to the timeline of the day Madison vanished. They identified a 2-hour window during which her phone had last pinged a tower near the industrial area and eventually went offline. This placed the phone in an area that Anderson frequently passed while heading to and from his rental property. While subtle, this coincidence was enough for police to request a warrant to search his truck. What they found inside deepened their suspicions. At first glance, the vehicle appeared clean, too clean actually. The interior was spotless, with seats wiped down to an almost obsessive degree. Detectives noticed the faint scent of bleach in the air, which Anderson shrugged off as just cleaning supplies. But forensic analysts found traces of dirt and vegetation under the floor mats, and tiny fragments of fabric wedged into the crevices of the truck's cabin. These items didn't tell a story on their own, but their presence contradicted Anderson's claim that he rarely drove outside of town, except for errands or fishing trips. It suggested he had spent time in wooded or rural areas, not accounted for in his account of the day Madison went missing. One of the reasons investigators grew so focused on Anderson was his seemingly average life. On the surface, his lifestyle appeared completely normal. To the casual observer, Anderson came across as just another working-class man trying to make ends meet. He paid his rent on time, nodded politely to cashiers at the grocery store, and occasionally struck up small talk with neighbors about the weather. But it was the details that began to unravel that facade. Experts often point to a psychological pattern in cases like this. Suspects attempting to conceal involvement in a crime often go out of their way to appear ordinary. They know the weight of suspicion and overcompensate to avoid drawing attention. Anderson wasn't just polite, his behavior was almost too careful, as if choreographed to deflect scrutiny. One of Anderson's neighbors, who spoke anonymously to police, shared something unsettling. A few days after Madison disappeared, they'd noticed Anderson returning home late at night, carrying what looked like a large plastic bag. The bag appeared heavy, and Anderson had quickly walked it around to the back of the property, seemingly aware that someone might be watching. The neighbor dismissed it at first, assuming he was likely disposing of regular household trash. But when news of the investigation surfaced, they began to doubt their initial impressions. The sight of Anderson hosing down his truck for hours after that night only deepened their concerns. Meanwhile, investigators broadened their focus to Anderson's online activity. A search of his internet history revealed that, in the days before Madison's disappearance, he had conducted numerous searches for topics connected to wooded trails, surveillance camera, blind spots, and even articles about missing persons cases. Perhaps most unsettling of all, he had looked up methods on how to wipe down surfaces to eliminate trace evidence. While not necessarily incriminating on their own, These searches painted the image of someone who had been preparing for something not a typical activity for someone with a straightforward, quiet routine. Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, detectives lacked the definitive proof they needed to connect Anderson directly to Madison's disappearance. That changed when another neighbor stepped forward with a new tip. Several months earlier, they recalled hearing Anderson talking to a contractor who had visited the property about how he knew every trail in the woods like the back of his hand. The neighbor also noticed something peculiar. Anderson would leave the house carrying shovels and work gloves, heading towards secluded areas nearby. When asked if Anderson explained this behavior, the neighbor could only remember him laughing it off as yard work his landlord would never notice. To investigators, these habits suddenly seemed far more intentional. Anderson's behavior in and around wooded areas near Rathdrum prompted a painstaking search of his known haunts. A task force was brought in to scour several hiking and logging trails. Anderson had mentioned casually in conversations. The effort took days, but it paid off with an unsettling discovery. Less than a mile into one of the hiking trails, searchers found a small cluster of disturbed soiler patch that seemed different from the surrounding forest floor. Forensic teams rushed in, and beneath that disturbed earth, they uncovered a series of items that included fragments of torn clothing. One piece matched what Madison had been wearing on the day she was last seen, a section of denim that matched her ripped jeans, along with traces of grey fabric nearby. While these items didn't constitute direct evidence tying Anderson to the crime, their presence added to the growing pile of inconsistencies surrounding his story. Police pressed him harder during subsequent interviews, questioning him specifically about his time spent in wooded areas and his unexplained trips at odd hours. Under the weight of mounting evidence, Anderson began to crack. His previously rehearsed calm started to slip, and his responses became shorter, evasive. He now denied ever having been to the area where the clothing was found. Despite his earlier statements about knowing the trails, it was clear to detectives that he was growing overwhelmed. According to psychological experts, this type of pressure often brings out telling behaviors in suspects who believe their normal facade is collapsing. Anderson wasn't just faltering, he was unraveling in real time. With the discovery of the clothing fragments and Anderson's deteriorating composure, police upgraded him from a person of interest to their primary suspect. This shift came with renewed urgency. They obtained additional warrants to search his property and his truck more thoroughly. During this search, forensic experts would uncover a final piece of evidence, a fragment of material embedded in the truck's seat that appeared to match the torn fabric from the hiking trail. Now, the case against Gerald Anderson was stronger than ever. But it wasn't just the evidence that sealed his fate. It was a combination of his inconsistent alibis, nervous demeanor, and his attempts to hide behind the veneer of an ordinary life. For investigators, it became clear that uncovering the truth about Madison's disappearance would hinge on everything tying back to Anderson's seemingly mundane world. That revelation was just the beginning of the case against him. What came next would make it undeniable. With Gerald Anderson now identified as the prime suspect in Madison Graham's disappearance, investigators turned their attention to piecing together stronger evidence that could definitively link him to the crime. For weeks, teams of officers and forensic analysts reviewed everything they had: witness statements, search records, and physical evidence. It was a grueling process, made even more difficult by the limited resources available in their small town. Still, it hadn't added up to enough, and the clock was ticking. Detectives worried that if they couldn't build a solid case soon, the trail might go cold. This was when they made the decision to re-evaluate an area they had already combed during early search efforts, a densely wooded section of Rathdrum's outskirts. Known for its narrow trails and quiet spots frequented by hikers and hunters, it was already notorious for being difficult to search thoroughly. The decision to go back wasn't instinctive but rather almost accidental. During a strategy meeting, one of the investigators suggested that Anderson's comments about knowing the trails pointed to the possibility he might have relied on a more remote, less traveled payzone that could have gone unnoticed in prior sweeps. It wasn't a new lead as much as it was about looking at old paths with a sharper sense of focus. Earlier grid searches in this area had focused on parts of the trail closest to the main road, but this time, officers expanded their radius deeper into the terrain. The search, aided by an advanced drone equipped with imaging sensors, allowed detectives to map the landscape more thoroughly. It didn't take long for something to stand out. A patch of soil along an embankment appeared almost too neat, as if it had been carefully smoothed over, unlike the rest of the area, where leaves and debris covered the ground. At first glance, it wasn't anything dramatic, just an uneven section of dirt smaller than a picnic table, but for the officers combing through the woods, it was enough to trigger their instincts. Forensic specialists were called in to investigate further. As they scraped away at the soil, they began uncovering what appeared to be pieces of fabric. The initial task was slow and methodical, with every layer of dirt being examined carefully to preserve potential evidence. Within hours, the fragments of denim recovered were confirmed as part of the ripped jeans Madison had been wearing the day she disappeared. The discovery, while heartbreaking, was the first piece of physical evidence that directly tied her to the remote location. Officers shifted their efforts into overdrive, scanning every inch of the site for additional clues. The question that arose almost immediately was how this site had been missed in the earlier searches. The truth was, it's not uncommon for evidence to go unnoticed in initial investigations. According to a report on law enforcement strategies by the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, over 20% of significant evidence in missing persons cases is found in areas already searched, mostly due to human error, resource challenges, or the sheer complexity of the terrain. Small police departments like Rathdrum's often struggle with limited manpower and tools in the first weeks of a case, causing them to focus on what seems like the most accessible or obvious places. But why was this patch significant? Because it wasn't just an isolated location. It was only a short walk from one of the lesser-known trails Anderson had reportedly mentioned to another neighbor. This detail, combined with the distinct impression that the soil had been disturbed intentionally, convinced detectives that this might have been something far more calculated than they originally thought. The physical evidence began connecting Anderson to the scene, and suddenly, his claims of innocence seemed implausibly thin. The team didn't stop there. While investigators worked on the trail site, digital forensics experts revisited Madison's phone records, motivated by the discovery of her phone several days after she went missing. The analysis, which focused on the metadata buried within her smartphone, painted a chilling picture. It revealed a pattern of movement that matched closely with the areas Anderson regularly drove through and, most notably, showed her phone had been manually turned off in the vicinity of the industrial area. This put to rest any lingering theories about an accidental disappearance or involvement by an unknown party. It strengthened the narrative that whoever abducted Madison had a deliberate plan, one that was centered in places Anderson knew well. Evidence continued piling up when the forensic team analyzed the vehicle Anderson had painstakingly cleaned. Despite his best efforts, traces of soil under the wheel wells were consistent with the type of dirt found at the wooded site where Madison's jeans had been located. Additionally, tiny follicles of hair were recovered from the fabric of the truck's seats. DNA testing would later confirm that these samples matched Madison's. Taken alone, any one of these pieces might have been too small to definitively implicate someone, but together they told a compelling story. There's a term often used by law enforcement experts: confirmation bias. It describes the tendency to focus on information that supports one theory, while unintentionally ignoring details that contradict it. This phenomenon can lead to key evidence being missed or dismissed entirely. Early in Madison's case, the search effort had fallen victim to this, largely because investigators had focused their attention on likely scenarios based on statistics from potential abductions by strangers to accidental injuries near the woods. But Anderson's careful planning, coupled with the remoteness of the wooded area, made it a perfect storm of misdirection. As one lead detective noted, "We didn't realize until later how much of this case was hiding in plain sight." One of the most surprising discoveries, however, came not from physical evidence but from revisiting another piece of Anderson's behavior. Detectives had initially overlooked just how detailed his knowledge of the trails was when they'd first questioned him. While this seemed like nothing more than an odd comment at the time, in hindsight, it revealed how calculated he might have been. Someone unfamiliar with the area would have struggled to navigate the dense terrain, but Anderson's repeated mentions of perfect places to clear his mind now felt eerily specific. Revisiting his interviews with this new lens allows even the smallest detail to carry weight: the pauses in his speech, the casual deflections when asked about long gaps in his alibi. Yet, the discovery that proved most damning came from a place no one had initially thought to check, inside a second-hand store a few miles from Rathdrum. During routine calls to local businesses, police followed up with a clerk who had mentioned a man selling items shortly after Madison's disappearance. One of the items handed in that day was a small silver bracelet. While such a piece of jewelry might not stand out otherwise, it was distinctive enough to catch Karen Graham's eye when investigators showed it to her. It was a gift Madison had received for her 16th birthday, engraved with her initials and a small daisy charm. The clerk described the seller as middling in height, with dark hair, wearing a baseball cap that hid most of his face, While they couldn't positively identify Anderson from memory alone, the time frame matched his frequent trips into town. This bracelet shifted the stakes entirely. It wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was personal, intimate, like a thread connecting Anderson directly to Madison's disappearance. Despite his attempts at cleaning his truck, erasing his tracks, and keeping his movements vague, he had slipped in this one moment. This one item revealed the fragile cracks in his careful planning. The combined weight of the disturbed soil, the fabric fragments, the digital evidence, and now the bracelet led police to confront Anderson once more. He claimed the bracelet meant nothing, suggesting it might have been planted to frame him. His voice was uneven as he stumbled over his defense. Investigators weren't buying it. With every question, the holes in his story widened, and his once bland facade gave way to visible panic. While the evidence collected pointed in Anderson's direction, authorities knew they still faced an uphill battle proving premeditation. There was enough to arrest him, but building a case strong enough for conviction would involve untangling the timeline further and painting a fuller picture of what had happened to Madison. Though the woods had revealed critical clues, the legal case was only beginning to take shape. The bracelet, the fragments of her clothing, and the corresponding DNA evidence linked Anderson incontrovertibly, but prosecutors needed to ensure no detail could be twisted in his defense. Anderson's clean image was quickly disintegrating as the investigation progressed. Slowly, his actions weren't just viewed through the lens of suspicion, they began to look calculated and deliberate. The challenge now would be convincing a courtroom of his intent. Detectives prepared for the next phase with a critical eye, knowing they would need to tighten every loose thread before the trial began. The investigation into Madison Graham's disappearance was hitting its stride, but as the evidence against Gerald Anderson stacked up, police began to see cracks in what had seemed like the whole picture. A deeper dive into his background revealed inconsistencies that stretched far beyond Rathdrum. Detectives found themselves asking a question they hadn't considered before. Could Madison's case be part of a pattern? Anderson wasn't a lifelong resident of Idaho. In fact, he'd moved to Rathdrum less than a year before Madison went missing. A transient work history combined with frequent changes in address suggested that Anderson had never put down roots anywhere. This discovery prompted investigators to expand their search to look outside their cozy, wooded town and into jurisdictions Anderson might have passed through before arriving in Rathdrum. The shift in focus brought an immediate challenge. Each state, and even individual counties within a state, operates with its own systems, protocols, and access to resources. Detectives from Rathdrum were now stepping into unfamiliar territory, navigating everything from varying police procedures to the need for approval from different state law enforcement offices. Coordinating across states is never easy, one investigator later admitted in an interview. What's a priority in one jurisdiction might be gathering dust in another, but when you're chasing someone like Anderson, you don't have a choice, you just start piecing it together wherever you can. The first significant sign that this case could span beyond Idaho surfaced during a follow-up on Anderson's work history. Investigators learned that he had spent several months living in southeastern Washington, working odd jobs in construction and logging. Rathdrum police shared this information with Washington's state authorities, which brought a surprising response. It turned out that Anderson's name had come up in a local investigation around the same time he'd lived there. Specifically, police in the area had received a report about a young woman who had gone missing after leaving a grocery store late one evening. While the case was ultimately marked as unresolved, neighbors in the area had remembered seeing a grey truck parked near the entrance to a hiking trail less than a mile from the store. The description of the vehicle was eerily similar to Anderson's. The parallels between Madison's case and this one were difficult to ignore. Both involved small towns, wooded areas, and women who vanished without obvious explanation. The woman in Washington, however, had never been found, leaving fewer clues for investigators to work with. While detectives didn't have enough to prove a definitive connection between the two cases, they did find something else. Thanks to advancements in nationwide police databases, they were able to track the VIN number for Anderson's truck. What they uncovered was another breadcrumb. Toll records from Oregon showed that the vehicle had been logged passing through a series of highway checkpoints not long after the woman disappeared. This was where the investigation became increasingly complex. With evidence now suggesting Anderson had traveled extensively throughout the Pacific Northwest, detectives realized they needed to build a timeline of his movements. But piecing together cross-state activity isn't straightforward. Information sharing between jurisdictions can sometimes be slow, especially when agencies are dealing with high caseloads. Yet, modern technology came to their aid. Law enforcement's use of systems like VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, and digital surveillance software gave them a way to compare open cases across county and state lines. By entering Anderson's name, vehicle information, and description of his methods, detectives pulled reports of similar disappearances. The results, and the sheer number of them, were staggering. One of those reports led them to Montana, 3 years before Madison's disappearance. In another small rural town, a 22-year-old woman had been reported missing after setting out on an evening jog and never returning. Though her case had faded from public attention, her parents had held on to hope that she might one day be found. Details about her disappearance echoed patterns investigators were seeing in Anderson. She had been last spotted on a trail at dusk, and witnesses later recalled a partially obscured truck parked nearby. This truck, described as grey with noticeable dents, had so far eluded efforts to track it down and had been labelled as a dead lead. Now, with Anderson on their radar, authorities in Montana reopened the case, eager to see if they could match him to the scene. Working across multiple states came with its own difficulties, however. Investigators encountered jurisdictional walls where evidence couldn't always be shared immediately, and state laws meant that even something as simple as issuing a subpoena required careful coordination. Rathdrum's small team leaned heavily on the support of FBI field offices, which streamlined communications between different agencies involved. It wasn't an easy process, but slowly, connections began to take form. One of the more striking links came through forensic analysis tied to Anderson's truck. Soil samples taken from the undercarriage of the vehicle were sent to labs for detailed comparison. Analysts found traces of sediment that were consistent with areas in Montana and Oregon, in addition to the dirt from Rathdrum's wooded trails. Scientists were able to determine that the geological match was near perfect in areas close to known disappearance sites. For soil specialists working on the case, this not only confirmed Anderson's travel through these areas, but suggested he had potentially driven through or stopped near the exact locations where women had been reported missing. Another breakthrough came through phone records. Though Anderson had routinely switched devices, investigators recovered correspondence from an old prepaid phone he had once used. The records showed sporadic activity in states like Utah and Nevada, as if Anderson had made brief visits before returning to his usual routes. One transaction tied to the phone even showed him checking into a small motel along the border of Nevada and California, a place just 20 miles from where an unidentified woman's remains had been found off a rural highway in 2015. While this particular case didn't share all the hallmarks of Anderson's suspected involvement, the proximity made it difficult for authorities to completely rule him out. Of course, what made this situation especially hard to take for families was the sense of time slipping away. Many of the cases Anderson was now being linked to stretched back years, and without definitive evidence or admissions, those investigations were left suspended in uncertainty. But Rathdrum police remained focused. Modern tools, re-examined evidence, and sheer determination were slowly building a trail that brought Anderson closer to remaining accountable, not just for Madison but for the others. Technology shaped the way movement patterns were reconstructed. License plate cameras, sometimes forgotten in older cases, were revisited with fresh interest. Detectives pulled archived footage from highways and public intersections that Anderson was thought to have driven through at various points in his cross-state travels. In one recorded image, dated to late 2016 and captured at the edge of a Wyoming rest stop, Anderson's unmistakable grey truck appears paused at the side of the road. While no significant event was tied directly to that sighting, it confirmed a troubling truth. Anderson hadn't stayed in one town or state for long. He was elusive and mobile, choosing remote spots to blend into. The turning point came when all these pieces, digital breadcrumbs, physical evidence, and individual reports, began aligning. A review of Anderson's documented phone history placed him in the same vicinity as 2 Montana disappearance cases within days of when each victim was last seen. Cellular activity proved essential in narrowing gaps left by earlier investigations. Texts made using burner phones revealed subtle planning, Anderson sending messages late at night that hinted at scouting locations near isolated highways. One detective described the discovery of this data as the missing hinge, which tied the wide-ranging movement patterns together into one coherent narrative. The final confirmation wasn't flashy, but it was enough to leave an impact. Police working across state lines identified gas station receipts from southern Oregon that showed Anderson stopping for supplies. These receipts were time-stamped just hours after a woman in the area had failed to return home from an errand. The store's surveillance system caught the grey truck pulling into the lot, and while Anderson wasn't clearly visible, his distinctive walking gait matched earlier footage from Rathdrum's parking lot recordings. For officers who had spent months chasing faint trails, This moment felt decisive. Each state's data might have been barely noticeable on its own, but when combined, it told a story of careful evasion and deliberate planning. Now, detectives had more than just suspicions. The physical evidence, like the soil samples and the laundry list of vehicle sightings, placed him in key locations. His purchase of burner phones and casual movements across state lines showed an unsettling level of forethought. These weren't isolated incidents, but rather the signs of someone who had taken advantage of small towns and quiet landscapes to operate in the shadows. What had started as a local investigation in Rathdrum was now part of something much larger. But even with multiple threads tying him to Madison and other cases, one critical piece of the puzzle remained. What had Anderson confessed, or concealed, about that morning in Rathdrum? Detectives weren't ready to let their focus waver. His next interrogation would test their patience and strategies, but most importantly, it would determine if Anderson would finally admit the truth. After months of effort, and the growing weight of evidence tying Gerald Anderson to multiple disappearance cases, investigators sat him down for what they hoped would be the defining moment in the case. At this stage, they had soil samples, fragments of Madison Graham's clothing, and digital traces placing her and Anderson's vehicle in the same locations. They also had the bracelet recovered from the second-hand store that Madison's mother, Karen, had heartbreakingly confirmed as her daughter's. Anderson's incongruent alibis hadn't helped his credibility, and the evidence spoke louder than he ever could. But detectives knew a confession would be the key to locking in their case. Without it, Anderson could argue circumstantial evidence and complicate their chances at trial. The interrogation began early in the morning, with Anderson seated alone in a small, austere room. A half-empty cup of coffee sat in front of him, untouched, as the detective interviewing him quietly shuffled his notes. Anderson sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his face calm but closed off, watching every movement in the room. For minutes, there was silence. Standard procedure in many interrogations, designed to make the person being questioned feel the weight of that stillness. Finally, the detective began by laying the groundwork. He talked Anderson through the process, explaining how investigations evolve and why the evidence they'd collected couldn't just be dismissed. "I told them everything already," Anderson interrupted early on, his voice smooth but clipped. He reiterated the same points from his previous statements. He'd gone to the lake to fish, he didn't know Madison Graham, and he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The detective didn't interrupt him. Part of what makes police interrogations an effective tool, according to criminal psychologists, is patience. It's about creating just the right amount of tension so the suspect feels compelled to speak further in order to fill the gaps. As the hours passed, Anderson's calm demeanor started showing signs of strain. The detective presented timeline evidence, suggesting discrepancies in his story about where he'd been that morning and when. He posed questions Anderson couldn't fully answer, like why soil matching the wooded site near Rathdrum was found clinging to the underside of his truck. Anderson shifted in his chair, finally leaning forward, as if to emphasize his denial. "Like I said before, I go hiking out there sometimes. That doesn't mean anything." He was measured but defiant, his tone revealing that he was aware of how damning this conversation could become. The interrogation took a more emotional turn after photographs of the evidence were laid in front of him. The torn denim from the hiking trail, the bracelet Madison had worn, her smiling face printed on the missing posters that had flooded Rathdrum for weeks. Anderson's initial reaction was to look away. "This has nothing to do with me," he muttered, though his voice was noticeably quieter now. His body language followed suit, arms uncrossed and hands now resting stiffly on the table. What had once been defiance began to turn into discomfort. Experienced interrogators know that bridging the emotional distance is sometimes as important as the evidence itself. At this point, the detective switched tactics, focusing on Anderson's background. He asked about his childhood, his quiet tendencies, the frequent moves from one state to another. He didn't frame the questions as accusations. He made them feel conversational, as if he were trying to understand Anderson's perspective. A method called the read technique is often used in cases like this, where open-ended rapport-building questions slowly shift into scenarios that challenge inconsistencies in the suspect's story. The goal is to make denial feel less like an option without escalating aggression or hostility. When the detective slowly began weaving in more direct questions about Madison, Anderson's responses started to falter. By mid-afternoon, Anderson's stoicism had all but faded. His voice quivered slightly when confronted with the new evidence surrounding his truck, the soil analysis, the driver's seat hair samples, and how the timeline aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. When asked directly why multiple witnesses described him and his truck in areas connected to Madison's disappearance, his response was defensive. "People see what they want to see," he snapped. "You're all just trying to make me into someone I'm not." It becoming less of an outright denial and more of a deflection. The breakthrough came with what at first seemed like a small, slip-away detail. A second detective, joining the interrogation, casually reintroduced the recovered bracelet. He didn't accuse Anderson outright, but instead made an observation about how personal it was, how it clearly represented something significant in Madison's life. The detective paused and leaned back in his chair, letting the silence linger. "People don't usually lose things like that," he said quietly, "and they definitely don't trade them for cash unless someone took it from them." That observation hung in the air. Anderson didn't argue this time. The silence stretched on for minutes, broken only by the faint sound of a recorder capturing every passing second. Tears welled up in Anderson's eyes, not falling, but visible enough for the detectives to notice. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The room froze. This was the first indication of responsibility. The next question came carefully. "What didn't you mean, Gerald?" The detective's tone remained calm but steady, designed to draw him out. Anderson responded haltingly, I don't know. I don't know how it got that far." From there, Anderson unraveled in fragments, speaking rapidly at times and trailing off at others. He admitted he had passed Madison on the street that morning, recognizing her from around the neighborhood. He claimed he had been curious, stopping his truck when he saw her walking alone. What started as an attempt to talk, according to him, escalated when Madison became visibly uncomfortable and tried to walk away. Anderson described panicking, though he didn't clarify his exact actions. He claimed that things got out of hand, and that he didn't mean for it to go so far. The detectives didn't interrupt as he continued. Anderson's confession provided critical details about the timeline. He admitted to driving Madison out toward the wooded trails after she got into his truck, though he insisted it wasn't with the intent of harming her. He tried to justify his actions, saying she had agreed to talk things through, but became difficult once they reached the secluded area. His statements grew less coherent as he attempted to justify each decision, but what became obvious was how deliberate his actions had been. He described leaving her in the woods, visibly shaken, and driving into town to collect himself before returning later to clean up the evidence of her presence. Psychological experts explain that suspects often minimize their own actions during confessions, reframing them to reduce their level of perceived guilt. Anderson's confession followed this pattern, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as the detectives that he hadn't intended for things to go as they did, but his own words betrayed him. When detectives pressed about the torn jeans and Madison's other belongings found buried in the dirt, Anderson admitted only that he didn't know what else to do. The confession spanned hours, the weight of it settling over the room as Anderson spoke in circles around key moments. Still, it was enough to fill in the gaps in the evidence and align his involvement conclusively with Madison's disappearance. Anderson's tone remained defensive, even as his voice cracked under the strain of each admission. "I didn't hurt her on purpose," he repeated several times. But there was no escaping the fact that his actions, his deliberate choices, had ended Madison's life and shattered a family. For the detectives, it was a grim relief. They had what they needed now. Anderson's confession matched the timeline corroborated by physical evidence and surveillance data, confirming their theory piece by piece. But the most chilling part was what remained unsaid. Even during his confession, Anderson refused to articulate the full truth, leaving lingering questions about his motives and the possibility of other victims. For Karen Graham and her family, the confession brought the beginning of closure, but no relief. Madison's story would remain a painful memory for everyone who had searched tirelessly for answers. Anderson's words, though incomplete and self-serving, were a harsh confirmation of what the evidence had already suggested. And while he had finally spoken the truth, the depth of what he had done was something the town of Rathdrum, and beyond, would struggle to forgive or forget. Madison Graham was the kind of person who left an impression wherever she went. At just 17 years old, she seemed to carry a natural light that others gravitated toward. Her friends, her family, even her teachers all remarked on how her kind heart and unrelenting optimism made her stand out in their small community of Rathdrum. She wasn't someone loud or over the top in the way she approached the world, but rather someone who found joy in simplicity. Whether it was reading in the corner of the school library, walking her rescue cat, Tigger, on a leash, yes, she trained him, or stopping to help a neighbor with their groceries, Madison touched people's lives in quiet but impactful ways. She just had this energy that made you feel safe around her, said her best friend, Jessie Wilkes, during an interview for the local news. Even when you were having the worst day, she could make you laugh without even trying. Madison had a natural gift for connection, something her mother Karen often described as her superpower. She was the eldest of 3 siblings, and in many ways, she took on that role wholeheartedly, helping her younger brothers with homework, watching over them at the park, and breaking up their endless disputes over video games. Madison was like another parent sometimes, Karen said, holding back tears. She had this fire in her, but she was soft too. Gentle. Her dreams reflected that balance of compassion and determination. Madison had wanted to become a veterinarian ever since she was old enough to walk. She filled sketchbooks with drawings of dogs, cats, and even the occasional frog she had caught and released in the schoolyard. By the age of 14, she had convinced a local animal shelter to let her volunteer, despite technically being too young for the role. She'd show up 3 times a week, helping walk the dogs and feed the cats, always going above and beyond what anyone asked her to do. For Madison, it wasn't just about the animals, it was about giving them comfort. Her ambitious nature didn't end with her career hopes. Madison was 3 months into training for a half marathon at the time of her disappearance. Most mornings, she'd lace up her sneakers and head out before the sun rose, running through the quiet streets of her neighborhood and into nearby trails. It was her way of challenging herself, of creating structure and setting goals. In many ways, those runs became a perfect metaphor for Madison's personality, quietly determined, focused, and independent. She never waited for someone else to take the lead. She created her own path. But Madison's life was more than just aspirational goals. She loved music, with a particular soft spot for old-school soul records her mother had played on repeat when she was little. Her friends teased her endlessly for her taste in movies. She had a fondness for cheesy romantic comedies from the 2000s, but it was all part of her charm. She was just real, said her neighbor Sandra Lutz. The kind of girl you hope your kids turn out like. Sweet, polite, but with a lot of heart. Madison's world should have been as safe as it appeared. She lived in a community where people looked out for one another, where familiarity bred trust. It's part of the reason her disappearance hit Rathdrum so hard. She was everyone's daughter, sister, or friend. It felt personal. But looking back at the days leading up to her tragic fate, investigators couldn't ignore the intersecting threads that made her vulnerable. Her independence was one of her most admirable traits, but it also played a part in what would become a fateful encounter. While the details of how Madison first crossed paths with Gerald Anderson remain fuzzy, investigators pieced together a likely scenario based on fragments of his confession and witness statements. Anderson had only lived in Rathdrum for a short time before the crime, renting a house in a quiet neighborhood not far from Madison's family home. Madison's routine runs regularly took her past that area, though she never spoke of noticing anything unusual. It wasn't uncommon for her to smile or wave politely at people she passed on the street, especially if she recognized them from around town. While investigators believe her interaction with Anderson that morning may have been brief, it happened at the perfect intersection of opportunity and isolation. The street was sparsely populated, with long stretches where neighbors' houses were separated by dense woods. One particular morning stood out to a neighbor who later testified. They recalled seeing Anderson leaning against his truck, smoking, as Madison jogged past. Though they didn't think much of it at the time, Anderson was new to the area, and his presence wasn't immediately suspicious. It stuck in their mind after Madison vanished. Whether this was the first or only time Anderson had noticed her is unclear, but his passing comment during interrogation, "I'd seen her before. She seemed nice," hinted he may have been watching longer than anyone realized. In many victimology studies, crimes like Madison's often highlight a troubling dynamic, predators exploiting not just moments of opportunity, but also traits like kindness and openness. Victims in similar cases are often described as trusting, approachable, or simply going about a routine that made them visible to the wrong person. This overlap between routine and randomness is what makes cases like Madison's so devastating. She wasn't reckless or careless in her habits. She was a teenage girl following her usual path, something no one should ever fear doing in their own neighborhood. One moment in particular stood out to Karen when reflecting on those days. It was a seemingly small event, but it now haunted her. A few weeks before her disappearance, Madison had run into a man at the local convenience store as she grabbed a sports drink after a morning jog. When she came home, she casually mentioned someone at the counter, commenting on how motivated she must be to run so early. Karen remembered feeling a pang of protectiveness then, but Madison brushed it off as a friendly encounter. Whether or not this man had been Anderson, investigators couldn't confirm. But for Karen, the memory carried a weight she couldn't let go of, one brief interaction that, in hindsight, felt like a warning she hadn't been able to see at the time. Madison's openness wasn't a weakness, it was her strength. And yet, in the end, it was someone else's exploitation of that openness that brought such unimaginable pain to her family. Anderson's motive, revealed through his fragmented confession, painted a picture of someone who had likely been driven by obsession, opportunity, and control. He admitted to wanting just to talk when he first approached Madison that morning. But his own actions betrayed something darker. Detectives saw through the passive framing in his statements, recognizing the hallmarks of someone who had methodically manipulated the situation to his advantage. Anderson didn't target Madison because she was reckless or because of anything she did. It was simply because she was there, and he had the wrong intentions from the start. Understanding Madison's story offers a glimpse into the deeper tragedy of her loss. She wasn't just a victim of a crime, she was a sister who made pancakes for her brothers on Sunday mornings when Karen worked an extra shift. She was a friend who stayed up late, reviewing Jesse's college application essays, even though Madison's own were still unfinished. She was the kind of daughter who left sticky notes on the bathroom mirror for her mum. "Have a great day. Love you." Her life was more than the few days the nation spent focusing on her disappearance. It was years of small, stitched-together moments that made her who she was. And when Gerald Anderson stole that life, it wasn't just the Graham family he devastated, it was the entire community. Families began taking extra precautions, suddenly doubting the safety that Rathdrum had always promised. Joggers started running in groups or avoiding secluded trails altogether. For Karen, Madison's absence meant mourning the milestones she'd never get to see her daughter achieve. She had so many plans, Karen shared in an interview months later. College, vet school, getting a little house with a big yard so she could adopt all the dogs she wanted. None of us get to see that now. Perhaps the hardest reality to face is how random it all seemed. Madison wasn't a person who lived life carelessly. She was cautious, thoughtful, and surrounded by people who loved her deeply. Yet, despite all that, she became someone else's twisted fixation, a target chosen in a moment she could have never foreseen. It's in understanding her story that we grasp the senselessness of her loss and the depth of the impact her life had on those around her. Madison Graham's story wasn't about the end of her life, but the promise it held before it was cut short. Looking at the person she was reminds us of why this crime shook her community to its core. The town of Rathdrum, mourning one of its brightest lights, realized their sense of safety might never fully return. What remained, though, was a determination to seek justice, not just for Madison, but for the future of the small town that had once felt so untouchable. As the court case loomed, so did the question of how Rathdrum would come to terms with the aftermath of such a profound tragedy. Gerald Anderson's trial began nearly a year after Madison Graham's disappearance, but the emotional weight of the case had not diminished for her family or the community of Rathdrum. The courtroom was packed on the first day, rows filled with family members, reporters, and local residents who had followed every step of the investigation. For many, this wasn't just about justice, it was about finding closure for everything the town had lost. Madison's parents, Karen and Joe, were present every day of the proceedings, often clutching tissues or leaning on one another for support as the prosecution laid out the details of their daughter's final hours. The case presented by the state was strong. Prosecutors relied on the array of physical evidence linking Anderson to the crime, including forensic analysis of the soil on his truck, DNA from the hair fibers found in his vehicle, and the torn pieces of Madison's clothing recovered on the trail. The digital trail also proved vital in shaping the narrative. Phone records tied Anderson to the critical locations, while surveillance footage of his distinctive truck cemented his presence near the gas station where Madison's phone had been discarded. But it was Anderson's confession that took center stage. Prosecutors played clips from the interrogation, letting the jury hear his hesitant admissions. While Anderson had never explicitly admitted to harming Madison, his statements about her getting into his truck willingly and things getting out of hand painted a chilling portrait of what had happened that morning. The defense, however, pushed back. They attempted to frame Anderson's confession as coerced, painting him as a man overwhelmed by police pressure, desperate to tell them what they wanted to hear. They poked holes in the timeline and tried to argue that the recovered evidence had been circumstantial, but it was clear the weight of the prosecution's case was difficult to counter. For Madison's parents, sitting through the trial was described as gut-wrenching. Each day brought new details or evidence that forced them to relive their daughter's final moments. hearing them discuss her like she was just evidence. It broke my heart, Karen said in an interview shortly after the trial ended. But I knew we had to be there, for her. She deserved that. At one point, Madison's best friend Jessie took the stand, describing Madison's bright spirit and quiet determination in a statement filled with both love and wrenching sorrow. She was my person, Jessie told the court. The one I always went to when I didn't know what to do. And I'll never get to hear her voice again. The testimony and evidence took weeks to present, but the jury reached a unanimous verdict in just 8 hours of deliberation. Anderson was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping, sentences that came with life in prison without the possibility of parole. Madison's family wept openly as the verdict was read, her younger brothers clutching their mother tightly. Anderson showed little emotion, barely reacting as the judge handed down the sentence. For Rathdrum, the decision offered a sense of justice, but not relief. As Madison's uncle later told a reporter, "Justice is important, but it doesn't take away the pain." The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond the courtroom. For weeks, the town of Rathdrum could barely settle into its old rhythm. Parents became more protective, schools held safety assemblies, and community groups began advocating for improved street surveillance and lighting in more remote areas. The loss of Madison, a figure so emblematic of everything the community valued, youth, kindness, hope, left an absence that was hard to ignore. Conversations about the case dominated the aisles of local grocery stores, the bar stools at the diner, and the queues during Sunday service. People weren't just grieving, they were questioning. How had something like this happened here? Karen and Joe threw themselves into advocacy, determined to ensure their daughter's story would leave behind more than grief. They started a foundation in Madison's name, dedicated to supporting legislation that improved the way missing person cases were handled in rural towns. Their primary focus was on early response times, something experts have highlighted as a critical factor but often lacking in small police departments. In Madison's case, those early hours, while vital, had been bogged down by the assumption that she might have been out with friends or simply late checking in. A 2020 report from the National Criminal Justice Reference Service highlighted that missing person cases in rural areas face delays in over 30% of investigations, often due to limited resources or a lack of urgency. It was this issue that the Grahams hoped to address through their newfound advocacy, although Karen admitted the effort often felt bittersweet. "Every time I see her name on a poster or hear it at an event, it breaks me a little. But if even one family gets their child back because of her, it's worth it," she told a local journalist. Prosecutors called Anderson's conviction ironclad. But the truth was that Madison's case left unanswered questions that lingered, even as the legal chapter closed. Anderson's confession had been murky, with major gaps about his intentions and the exact details of Madison's final moments. Forensic experts could confirm she had been in his truck and later abandoned at the wooded trails. But a clear explanation from Anderson about why he had targeted her, what had gone through his mind that morning, was never provided. These silences frustrated not just investigators but also Madison's family. "We'll never know everything," Karen admitted. "And that, more than anything, keeps me up at night." Beyond Madison's case, Anderson's movements across state lines raised troubling questions about what else he might have been involved in. As soon as his name entered national databases, investigators in Montana and Washington reopened unsolved cases involving missing women that matched similar patterns. In Montana, an unidentified person's remains were re-examined after Anderson's truck had been placed near the location around the time they went missing. Another case in Oregon saw local detectives trying to match DNA evidence recovered from a wooded area to Anderson to establish more concrete ties. None of these investigations resulted in charges against Anderson, at least not yet, but the possibilities cast a long shadow over his past. Many wondered if Madison's wasn't the only life he had derailed. The psychological toll on Madison's family was profound and far-reaching. Studies on families affected by violent crime, like those published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, suggest that unresolved questions can deepen the trauma long after convictions are secured. These studies also highlight how community-wide losses, like Madison's, create ripple effects in small towns, where grief and anxiety spread quickly due to the close-knit nature of these places. In Rathdrum, counsellors reported an uptick in clients following the case, many of them teenagers grappling with the realization that their routines and sense of safety had been irrevocably changed. "Madison was one of us," said her high school principal in a press statement. "She wasn't just one person's loss, she was everyone's." Madison's story became a reminder of just how fragile safety can feel, even in places like Rathdrum, so often insulated from the turmoil of larger towns and cities. For some residents, this realization brought a rise in vigilance and caution. For others, it sparked frustration, a longing to go back to how things were before Anderson arrived in their community. But one sentiment remained universal. Madison Graham deserved better than the fate that found her. Lingering questions about Anderson's other possible crimes only deepened the wounds left behind. Was he, as prosecutors suggested, a predator who had spent years operating under the cover of small-town anonymity, leaving few traces behind? Or had Madison's encounter been an isolated act fueled by impulsive, dangerous curiosity? These were the kinds of questions that haunted those closest to the case, but answers seemed just out of reach. Detectives pledged to continue working, revisiting old clues in other states tied to Anderson's long and transient past. Even years later, Rathdrum felt the imprint of Madison's loss. A memorial bench now sits near the town library, engraved with her favorite quote, "Do small things with great love." It's a quiet gesture, one that reflects the kind of person Madison was, and the kind of person her family refuses to let be forgotten. As Karen put it during the dedication ceremony, this is a scar that won't disappear, but we can choose what to do with the pain. For her, that choice meant steering the memory of her daughter into something meaningful, something lasting. The case left behind more than just scars. It became a window into the fragility of trust and the resilience of small communities in the face of something unthinkable. The ripples may never fully fade, but they carry with them a message of vigilance, advocacy, and love, a reflection of Madison's quiet strength. Madison Graham's story is a reminder of how lives can change in an instant, even in places that feel safe. Her disappearance shattered a community's sense of security, revealing the cracks in the systems meant to protect us. While her family channeled their grief into action, advocating for change, questions remain about Gerald Anderson's past and the true extent of his actions. This case shows how small threads can lead to justice, but it also reflects the fragility of what we often take for granted. What can we do, as individuals, to ensure voices like Madison's are never silenced again?